White wife abandons black husband and 5 kids, comes back 10 years later begging. She left her black husband and 5 kids without a word. No goodbye, no explanation. Just a note on the table and silence for 10 long years. But what happens when the woman who abandoned everything comes back? This isn't just about heartbreak. It's about a black father the world underestimated, and the unstoppable family he built without her. What she found when she returned wasn't the broken mess she expected. It was strength, it was truth, it was black, unbreakable. Keep watching, you're not ready for how this ends. His white wife vanished, leaving a black father with 5 kids alone. The door creaked open just a sliver. The cold morning light spilled across the living room floor like a truth no one was ready to face. Darius stood in the frame, silent, his broad shoulders still dusted with flour from the pancakes he never got to flip. In his right arm, he held his youngest daughter, Nia, barely a year old, still in her footed pajamas. In his left hand, just a note, 7 words, written in the soft, slanted cursive he knew better than his own signature. "I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore." He stared at the paper, reading it over and over like it might rewrite itself if he blinked enough times. But it didn't. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful but hollow, the kind of quiet that echoes through a man's chest long after the sound is gone. There was no warning, no fight, no stormy night before. Alicia had kissed him good night. She had read to Illa. She had folded the laundry. She had said, "See you in the morning." But there was no morning with her in it. She was gone. And Darius Miller, a black man raising 5 children in a world too eager to judge him before they knew his name, was now alone. The oldest, Micah, 11 at the time, was the first to speak. "Where's Mom?" His voice cracked like dry wood, trying to sound strong for the younger ones but already sensing something wasn't right. Darius couldn't answer. His mouth opened but nothing came out. So he lied, because what else could he do? She went to visit her sister. She just needs some time. Illa, only 6, looked up at him with wide eyes that begged for more truth, more hope. Something to hold on to. Did we do something wrong? And he wanted to scream no. He wanted to fall to his knees and scream at the ceiling and punch a hole in the sky if it would bring her back. But all he did was kneel down and hug his children close. "No, baby, this isn't your fault." That was the first morning. The second morning hit harder, because that's when it sunk in. She wasn't coming back. The diaper bag was still by the door. Her favorite mug sat in the sink. The lavender candle she always lit after dinner had burned halfway down the wick. But she was gone, and in her place was Darius. One man, 5 kids, one kitchen full of dishes, and a mountain of silence. He called in late to work, then he called in absent, and then he quit the night job altogether. He had no choice. The cost of childcare for 5 kids under 12 was more than his paycheck. That week, he burned dinner 3 times. Jadden, age 9, scraped the black crust off the bottom of the mac and cheese and said nothing. Micah folded laundry in silence. Illa had her first nightmare since toddlerhood. Nia cried constantly, not for food, not for toys, just cried, and still Darius tried. He woke up every day at 5 a.m., not because he was a morning person, but because 5 little humans depended on him. Every morning, he'd pour a half cup of stale coffee into Alicia's favorite mug. It was chipped now from the night it fell when he tried to grab it too fast. But he still used it, not to remember her, but to remind himself she left. I didn't. At 6:30, the chaos began, Micah making toast for the little ones. Jadden arguing about cereal choices. Illa crying because one sock had a hole in it. Nia toddling around with a spoon in her mouth. He never got to finish that cup of coffee. But when he heard them laughing, when they forgot to be broken just long enough to giggle about spilled milk, he remembered what he was fighting for. Outside in the world, people looked at him differently. A tall black man with 5 children and no wife. Some assumed he was irresponsible. Some pitied him. Most didn't ask questions. The woman at the grocery store said it without saying it. 5 kids, huh? You sure they're all yours? He looked her dead in the eye. Every single one. Some days he felt like a walking stereotype waiting to be judged. But every night when he tucked them in, Micah with a textbook on his lap, Illa clutching her teddy bear, he knew no one on the outside could define what they had inside. He didn't ask to be a hero. He just refused to be a ghost. And though the world might have looked at him and seen failure waiting to happen, he was becoming something no one saw coming. He was becoming the anchor of a ship left drifting. He was becoming the whole damn lighthouse. And yet, in the quiet, in the dark, when the kids had fallen asleep and the house settled back into stillness, he still sometimes asked the same question. Why did she leave? Not just him, but them. A black father of 5 walks alone through a world that won't see him. The alarm buzzed at 4:55 a.m., and Darius was already half awake. Not because he had gotten enough rest, but because sleep never truly came anymore. Not the kind that heals. He lay there in the dark for a few seconds, listening to the soft hum of the baby monitor, the slow breathing of 5 children in 3 different rooms, the weight of responsibility pressing on his chest like a second heartbeat. He sat up slowly, rubbed the sleep from his face, and walked barefoot to the kitchen. It was quiet except for the sound of the refrigerator humming and the soft creak of the old floorboards under his steps. He poured coffee into the chipped blue mug, the one Alicia used to love, and lit the stove with a sigh. The box of pancake mix was nearly empty, but he stretched it the best he could. By the time the batter hit the pan, he was already calculating. Lunches, backpacks, clean socks, field trip forms, Jadden's inhaler, Micah's school meeting, gas in the van, leftover pasta for dinner, maybe. The pancake burned while he was tying Nia's shoelaces. He scraped it off the pan with a dull spatula and placed it on a plate anyway. No time to waste. Illa was already crying because someone had taken her pink headband, and the twins were arguing over who got the blue cereal bowl. He raised his voice, but gently. Everybody breathe. I got you, one thing at a time. By 6:45 a.m., all 5 kids were in motion, shoes being tied, teeth brushed in pairs, coats slung over chairs. Darius moved through the chaos like a conductor with no baton. He double-knotted laces, wiped syrup from mouths, tucked notes into backpacks, and kissed foreheads without breaking pace. He didn't finish his coffee. Outside, the sky was still gray. The air held the cold bite of early fall. He loaded the kids into the van one by one, buckled every strap himself. And then he drove, first to elementary school, then middle school, then daycare. The van was old. The heat only worked on one side. One of the windows wouldn't roll up all the way. He kept a roll of duct tape in the glove box just in case. At the construction site, the noise of drills and saws and steel hitting concrete drowned out the thoughts in his head. He didn't mind the noise. It was the only thing louder than the ache. You good, D? Harold, his supervisor, gave him a nod as Darius stepped out of the van. Yeah, I'm here. He always said that. Not fine, not okay, just here. His hands were rough from work and dish soap. His boots were worn through at the heel. And still he showed up. Day after day. The others at the job site talked about fantasy football, barbecues, their wives' complaints. Darius mostly stayed quiet. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but because he wasn't sure they'd listen if he did. They didn't understand what it meant to clock out at 4, race through traffic to grab 3 kids before daycare fees kicked in, cook a full meal, check homework, clean spills, bandage knees, fix leaking faucets, and still be the only adult voice at the table. They didn't understand what it meant to walk through the grocery store and feel eyes watching him like a question they were too polite to ask. All yours? The cashier said it with a smile, but her eyes lingered too long. Darius didn't flinch. Yes. Every single one. He paid with coupons and cash, avoided eye contact, kept his head down. Outside, he loaded bags into the van, shoulders stiff, jaw tight. They don't see the father, they see a problem. That thought sat with him as he sat alone in his truck during lunch break. He didn't eat with the others. Instead, he stayed in the cab with the window cracked just enough to feel the breeze, the sound of hammers distant like background noise. He opened a sandwich, just 2 slices of white bread with a single piece of ham, no mustard, no mayo. He chewed slowly, then he broke. The tears came quietly without warning. He pressed his forehead to the steering wheel and let them fall, just for a minute. A grown man crying in a work truck with his name on the hard hat and 5 mouths to feed. He wasn't crying because he was weak. He was crying because he was tired, and no one ever asked how he was doing. At night, when the kids were asleep and the dishwasher buzzed in the background, he would sit on the edge of the couch, rubbing his hands together, staring into nothing. He didn't have time to grieve. He didn't have time to fall apart. The world wasn't built to catch men like him when they fall, especially not black men, not black fathers. Not when they're the only one standing between their children and the weight of everything. So he stood, every day. He stood with cracked boots, tired eyes, a burnt pancake on the stove, and love that didn't need applause to be real. And still, some nights he whispered to himself before bed, "You're doing enough, you're still here." And he was, even when the world refused to see him. The oldest son carried the weight she left behind. Micah was only 14, but his eyes held a tiredness that didn't belong to boys his age. He walked through the house not like a kid, but like someone who had learned too early that childhood doesn't always wait for permission. While others his age played video games or chased bikes down sidewalks, Micah knew how to boil pasta, braid his sister's hair, and tell when Nia's fever was more than just teething. He never complained. When Darius came home from a double shift, the house didn't fall apart, because Micah kept it together. That evening, the kitchen smelled like garlic and overcooked rice. Micah stood at the stove in an old hoodie, stirring with one hand and texting with the other. Darius leaned against the counter, peeling carrots. The light above them flickered. The air was warm from the stove, thick with unspoken things. Darius watched his son for a moment before speaking. "You're getting good at that." Micah didn't look up, had to. "Illa hates when the noodles stick. Says it feels like worms." They both chuckled quietly. Micah turned down the flame and leaned against the sink. His shoulders slumped, not from bad posture, from years of carrying too much. There was a pause. Then Micah asked the question he'd never asked out loud before. "Dad, did she ever call?" The spoon in Darius's hand froze in midair. The words hit like wind through an open door. He didn't answer right away. Just stared down at the carrots, then set the knife aside. "No, son, not once." Micah nodded slowly, lips pressed tight. He wasn't surprised. But hearing it out loud did something different. It made the silence real. "She just left us." Darius wiped his hands on a dish towel, walked to the stove and turned the knob until the burner clicked off. Then he looked at his son, not like a father to a child, but like one man to another. "Yeah, she left us." Micah looked away, jaw tense. He didn't cry, he never cried. He had learned not to, somewhere between teaching Nia to hold a bottle and helping Illa with long division. "It's not fair, I know. She gets to walk away and I gotta be the one to keep everyone from falling apart." Darius stepped closer. "You shouldn't have to. That wasn't your job. Then who else was gonna do it?" The words came sharp, not out of disrespect, but exhaustion. Darius didn't flinch. "I was supposed to. You were just a kid." Micah finally looked him in the eye. "But I'm not anymore, am I?" Darius didn't answer. Because there was no answer that didn't sting. He placed a hand on Micah's shoulder, felt the bones beneath the hoodie, the weight he carried, the quiet resilience that had kept the family standing. "You grew up too fast, son, I see that." "And I'm sorry." Micah looked down, his voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes I forget what her voice sounded like. Darius closed his eyes for a moment. That truth cut deeper than any blade. Me too. In the quiet that followed, the only sound was the soft bubbling of the pot. The lights hummed. The house felt both full and hollow at once. Darius turned back to the cutting board. "Let's finish dinner." Micah didn't move right away. He stared at the counter, then grabbed a spoon and stirred the sauce like he'd done it 100 times. Because he had. Together, they moved through the kitchen like two parts of the same song. No one told them how to do this. No one showed them how to survive after someone disappears. But they were surviving anyway, not because they were unbroken, but because they chose not to stay shattered. A letter from the past shakes the black father who raised them alone. The envelope was thin, slightly wrinkled, cream-colored, tucked between a utility bill and a takeout menu. Nothing about it screamed importance, but Darius knew. He knew the moment his fingers touched it. The handwriting on the front was like a whisper from a memory he'd tried to forget. Soft cursive. The way she used to sign birthday cards. The loop of the L, the lowercase I dotted with a faint circle instead of a dot. Alicia. 10 years, no calls, no postcards, no child support, just this. A single envelope. He stood in the kitchen with his work boots still on, the kids yelling in the background about a missing phone charger and whose turn it was to pick the movie. The house, though filled with noise, suddenly felt distant, muffled. Like everything had slipped underwater. He didn't open it. He couldn't. Instead, he slid it into the pocket of his flannel jacket and pressed it against his chest. It stayed there as he cleared dishes, helped Illa with her spelling, tucked in the twins. It stayed there through the night, even when he changed for bed. The envelope never left his reach. At the construction site the next morning, the letter was still tucked inside his jacket. Every time he bent down to lift a beam or reach for a wrench, he felt it shift slightly over his heart like a ghost, reminding him it was still there. Micah noticed something was off. "You good?" "Yeah, just tired." He wasn't lying. He was always tired, but this was different. In the break room, he sat alone, lunch untouched. He pulled the envelope halfway out, stared at it, then slid it back in. His hands shook, not from fear exactly, but from something heavier. A mixture of confusion and rage and grief he had no name for. That night, after the house settled and the children were finally asleep, he sat on the edge of his bed. The lamp cast a warm glow over the room, over the photos of birthdays she had missed, over the framed drawing Illa made of "My Daddy, My Hero" that still hung crooked by the mirror. He took a breath, opened the envelope. It began with 5 words. "I know I failed you." She said she had gone through therapy, that she'd been overwhelmed back then, that she hadn't meant to disappear, it was panic, not malice, that her leaving wasn't about them, it was about her. She talked about faith, about reflection, about rebuilding. Then came the part that tightened Darius's chest like a vice. "I've changed, I want to see them," that was it. No questions, no mention of what she missed. Not a word about Micah taking care of his siblings like a grown man before he was old enough to shave. No apology for the nights Illa cried herself to sleep asking for a mother who never came. No understanding of the pain she dropped on their doorstep and walked away from like it was never hers to carry. He folded the letter slowly, carefully, like it might shatter if he moved too fast. He didn't rip it. He didn't curse. He just sat there in the dim light, the letter resting on his lap like a weight rediscovered. The next day, he didn't mention it. Not to Micah, not to Jadden, not to anyone. But the letter stayed with him, in his coat, in his chest. Like a door that had once slammed shut behind him, now creaking open again without warning. And he had no idea what waited on the other side. She claimed she changed, but the truth revealed her real motive. It started with a screen, a glow in the dark. Micah sat on the living room couch after the others had gone to bed, scrolling aimlessly on his phone, headphones half in, the weight of the week sitting heavy on his shoulders. He hadn't said much since Darius read the letter aloud 3 nights ago. The air in the house had shifted, like everyone was holding their breath and didn't know why. Micah clicked a link without thinking, then paused. His eyes narrowed. The page was plain, a fundraiser site. The title read in bold letters, starting over after setbacks. A picture of Alicia stared back. Her hair was pulled back. Her smile looked more like an apology than joy. He read the first line aloud under his breath. "I'm rebuilding after a difficult chapter. Life humbled me." Micah's eyes darted to the donation bar. A few $100 raised, dozens of comments. Words like "stay strong," "you're brave," "you got this." But no mention of them, not one. No photo of the kids, no words like "mother," no sentence like "I left 5 children behind." Just a narrative, curated, clean. Sanitized for sympathy. Micah's jaw tightened. He stood, walked into the kitchen, and set the phone down in front of Darius, who was rinsing dishes at the sink. "You need to see this." Darius dried his hands, took the phone, and stared. The words blurred slightly, not from confusion, from something deeper. He scrolled slowly, then stopped. There it was. "I've reconnected with someone from my past who may help me regain stability." Darius set the phone down. His face didn't change, but his eyes hardened. "She's not coming back for us," Micah said quietly. "She's coming back because she's sinking." The words landed like bricks in the room. Darius didn't respond. He walked to his bedroom, pulled open the drawer where the letter had been sitting. He unfolded it again. Same soft script, same promises, but now the meaning had changed. She said she wanted forgiveness. But she never once asked about the children by name. The next morning, Darius made a call, a number given to him years ago by a man he'd helped on a job site. Quiet, discreet, expensive, but thorough. "I need a private investigator. I want the truth. No assumptions, no gaps, just facts." The man agreed, said he'd have a report in a few days. Darius hung up, stared out the window as the sun began to rise. He watched Illa chase the twins across the backyard through the glass. Watched Micah refill the bird feeder without being asked. He couldn't afford to guess anymore. He needed to know what he was protecting them from. 3 days later, the call came. Alicia is currently unemployed. She's been in and out of short-term jobs for the past 6 years. Credit cards maxed out. 2 lawsuits pending. She's 3 months behind on rent. An eviction notice was filed 6 weeks ago. She's used your name, full name, in 2 separate conversations on public forums. In one, she said reconnecting with you and the kids might be her way back. Darius didn't speak, just listened. "There's more," the investigator added. "She's mentioned the possibility of documenting a reunion online to inspire others. Could be for traction or financial support." Darius's stomach turned. This wasn't about family. It was about survival. That evening the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm or after a realization. Micah sat across from him at the table. Darius slid the folder over. "She's not coming back to build anything. She's coming to borrow from what we already built." Micah opened the folder, scanned the documents, then looked up. "So what do? We protect what's ours." Micah didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just nodded once. "All right then." Outside, the wind picked up. The leaves scratched against the windows, the world kept moving. But inside that house, one truth had settled like concrete. She had left without looking back. And now, she was only turning around because she had nowhere else to go. The mother returned after 10 years, but her children were no longer waiting. The wind that morning carried a strange kind of silence. Not the gentle peace of spring, but the tension of something unsaid, something approaching. The sky hung heavy with gray, and the leaves along the sidewalk twitched restlessly, as if they, too, could sense what was coming. Darius stood at the edge of the park near the duck pond, hands in the pockets of his old jacket, the same one he wore to every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every doctor's visit. Beside him stood all 5 of his children. Micah had his arms folded across his chest. Jadden shoved his hands deep into his hoodie. Illa stayed close, fingers brushing her dad's coat. The twins sat on the bench behind them, quiet, wide-eyed, confused. They had all agreed to come, not because they missed her, not because they hoped for hugs or apologies, but because knowing the truth, facing it, was better than wondering what if for the rest of their lives. Darius had given them the choice. "You don't have to do this," he said the night before. "If any of you don't feel ready, we walk away." But Micah had answered first. "We need to look her in the eye." So here they were. The park was nearly empty, just a jogger in the distance and an elderly man feeding birds from a torn paper bag. The branches overhead cast long shadows across the ground. Everything about the morning felt suspended. Then she appeared. Alicia walked slowly from the parking lot, her figure thinner than memory, her coat too light for the weather. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, strands clinging to her cheeks. Her eyes scanned the group from a distance, then landed on the children. She hesitated, then took a few steps closer. "Hi," her voice was soft, uncertain. She stopped a few feet away. "I've missed you all every single day." No one responded. Micah stared straight at her, unreadable. Jadden looked down at his shoes. Illa took one small step back. Darius remained still, his face unreadable but calm. "I was lost," Alicia said again, her voice shaking. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want to reconnect, if you'll let me." She glanced at Darius as if hoping for a nod, a word, something, but he said nothing. "I've changed. I've been working on myself, therapy, church, everything." Her words hung in the air, limp, unmoored. They floated like empty paper cups in the wind. Then Micah stepped forward. He didn't yell, he didn't cry. His voice was level, his tone quiet but sharp. "What do you want from us?" Alicia blinked. I want to be in your lives. I want to rebuild something." Micah tilted his head. After 10 years, Alicia's eyes filled with tears. "I made mistakes. I was scared. I didn't know how to come back." And now, Micah's face hardened, but his voice never rose. "What do you expect us to do with this? Just forget everything? The birthdays, the crying, the questions we had to answer without you?" Alicia looked at the others, desperate for a soft gaze, a crack in the wall, but none came. Illa pressed herself into Darius's side. Jadden took the twins' hands without being told. "I didn't stop loving you," Alicia whispered. "You stopped showing up," Micah replied. She reached into her bag, pulled out a small envelope. "This is for you, letters, one for each of you. You can read them when you're ready." Micah didn't move. Neither did anyone else. After a moment, Darius stepped forward. He took the envelope. He didn't thank her, just tucked it under his arm. Alicia's voice cracked again. "Please, just let me try." Micah looked at her one last time. "You left, we stayed, and we became a family without you." He turned and walked back toward the car. One by one, the others followed. No one looked back. Darius was the last to move. He glanced at Alicia once, nodded, not out of forgiveness, but finality. A quiet closing of a door that should have never been left open that long. As he walked away, Alicia stood alone by the pond, her arms wrapped around herself, her breath clouding in the cold. Behind her, the ducks kept gliding across the water, unbothered. The moment had passed. And this time, they didn't wait for her to catch up. He didn't just love them, he protected them with the law. The living room was quiet, not the kind of quiet that came with peace, but the stillness of children waiting to understand something their hearts already feared. The manila envelope sat on the coffee table like a silent witness, thick with truth. The report from the private investigator had arrived that morning, but Darius hadn't opened it in private. He waited until dinner was done, until dishes were cleared, until no one could say they weren't ready. He sat at the head of the table, back straight, face calm but unreadable. "Kids," he said gently, "I need you to see something." He opened the folder and spread its contents slowly, like a teacher laying out the final pages of a lesson no one wanted to learn. Receipts, screenshots, court notices, social media posts, Alicia's debts, her evictions, her stories. Her online comments. She said reconnecting with us might help her bounce back. Micah didn't flinch. Jadden frowned. The twins leaned into each other silently, but Illa, soft, sensitive Illa, spoke what everyone else didn't dare say. "So she didn't come back because she missed us." Darius looked at her. His eyes softened. He reached across the table and took her hand. "No, baby, she didn't." Illa blinked hard. "So she doesn't love us." A long pause. Darius closed the folder. "Love is complicated, sweetheart. But real love shows up and stays." He stood slowly and walked to the bookshelf, pulled out another envelope. This one was thicker. He held it like it mattered more than any paper he had ever touched. "I've been keeping this for the right time." He sat back down and opened it. Inside were legal documents, official stamps, signed pages. "Years ago, I made a decision. I adopted each of you legally, every single one of you. This family isn't just real in my heart, it's real in the eyes of the law." Micah's head lifted. "You did that without telling us?" Darius nodded. "Because love isn't always loud. Sometimes it works quietly in the background, making sure you're safe even when you don't know it needs to." Jadden stared at the pages, wide-eyed. "So she can't take us away?" "No, she can't." Illa looked up again, her lip trembling. "You really did all this just to keep us?" Darius leaned in. His voice was steady, strong. "I don't talk a lot, but love, real love, isn't always in the words. Sometimes it's in paperwork, in sacrifice, in showing up day after day. Love is legal, love is real, and love never walks out that door." The room stayed silent, but something shifted. Not tension, not fear, security. Micah pushed his chair back and walked over. He didn't say anything. He just hugged his father, tight, long, the way a boy hugs a man who didn't just raise him but protected him. One by one, the others followed. The table was forgotten. The papers scattered like proof of something no one ever doubted again. In that moment, there were no more questions, because the answer had always been right in front of them. He didn't just stay. He built something no one could take away. She admitted the truth, and he chose not to answer. The envelope was smaller this time. No return address. No scent of lavender. Just plain white paper, creased at the corners like it had been held too tightly before being mailed. Darius found it wedged between the electric bill and a coupon flyer. He knew the handwriting before he opened it. This time, he read it alone. Standing at the kitchen counter as the late afternoon sun poured in across the tiles, warming the floor beneath his feet. Alicia's words were short, not poetic, not dressed up in therapy terms or hollow hope. She had come back, she wrote, because she was desperate, not because she had healed, not because she had rediscovered love, but because life had collapsed beneath her feet and she had reached for the only thing that once felt real. "I see now," she wrote. "You already built something without me, and I don't belong in it." She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't ask for another chance. She simply promised not to reach out again. Darius folded the letter in half, then in half again. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just slipped it into the drawer next to the batteries and spare keys and quietly closed it. That was it. The door that had been cracked open by a memory had finally, softly closed. Outside, the sounds of summer were coming back to life. Illa and the twins ran barefoot through the yard, chasing bubbles that shimmered gold in the sunlight. Jadden stood by the porch with a water gun, laughing harder than Darius had heard in weeks. Micah sat cross-legged under the tree, earbuds in, head nodding softly to music. The backyard wasn't perfect. The grass had patches. The fence leaned slightly at one end, but it was theirs, and more importantly, it was whole. Darius stepped out onto the porch, holding a glass of sweet tea, and leaned on the rail. The evening sun cast everything in warm amber light, the kind that made even the tired look peaceful. A breeze carried the sound of laughter up toward the porch, mixed with a faint beat from the portable speaker Micah had left playing. The song was old, soulful, a little scratchy from wear. Micah looked up and met his father's eyes. "You good?" "Yeah," Darius said. "I am now." Micah nodded and smiled, a quiet smile, the kind that didn't need explanation. The wind rustled the trees gently, and for the first time in a long time the air felt light. No unfinished conversations, no fear of the past knocking again. Just children who were safe, a father who never left, and a new season stretching out in front of them. Not perfect, but peaceful, and finally completely theirs. She walked away, but he stayed, and built a family unbreakable. The sky over their neighborhood was the color of soft gold, brushing the rooftops with light as if the day itself was proud of what had grown there. The yard was full again, not with questions or silence, but with sound. Real sound. Joy. Motion. Life. Micah stood on the porch with a college brochure in one hand, his acceptance letter in the other. Darius watched from the doorway, arms crossed, his face unreadable but his eyes wet. "You did it, son." Micah didn't answer right away. He just nodded, eyes glinting with something deeper than pride. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was the silent realization that he wasn't just leaving for college. He was walking through a door his father had spent 10 years holding open. Jadden was already in the yard, ball at his feet, shouting plays like he was already on the field. He had made the soccer team, not as a substitute, as a starter. His coach had pulled Darius aside just a week before and said, "You raised a leader." Illa twirled on the grass near the edge of the flower bed, her ballet shoes dusty, her face glowing in the afternoon light. She had returned to dance, not because someone pushed her, but because she was ready to move again, to open again. The twins chased each other under the big oak tree, their giggles wild and free. No more clinging to legs. No more hiding behind doors when someone rang the bell. Their laughter had returned like music that had been paused for too long. Inside, the house was the same and yet entirely new. Same couch. Same chipped mug in the kitchen. Same photos on the wall, but the energy, the soul had shifted. The air no longer carried the weight of a woman who never returned. It carried the strength of the man who had never left. Darius sat at the kitchen table later that night, his fingers tracing the edge of a sealed envelope. Not a letter this time. Legal documents, college applications, soccer schedules, Illa's recital flyer, stacks of life moving forward. Micah walked in quietly, sat across from him. "You tired?" "Always," Darius said with a soft laugh. Micah looked around the room, his voice low. "I still think about her sometimes. Not a lot, but enough." Darius nodded. "That's okay. You don't have to erase her, you just don't have to carry her anymore." Micah sat back, thoughtful. "You ever wonder what would have happened if she stayed?" "Sometimes," Darius admitted. "But then I look at all this, at all of you." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "She left, but I didn't. And that was enough to build something the world said we couldn't. Micah's throat tightened. We're not broken. No, Darius said, we're built. There was no music playing. No celebration, no confetti, just a father and son sitting in a house that shouldn't have survived the storm. But did. Because love, when it's real, doesn't run, it roots, it stays. And in this house, it built something unshakable. Sometimes the most powerful love is the one that never leaves. Not loud, not perfect, but present. Darius didn't have all the answers. He didn't have wealth or help or applause, but he had heart, he had grit. And he showed us that being a father isn't about being flawless. It's about being there. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. This story reminds us that family isn't always about who stayed in the beginning. It's about who stayed through the storms. And sometimes the strongest families are the ones the world never believed could make it. So maybe the question isn't why someone left. Maybe it's who chose to stay. And in that choice, a legacy is born. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own journey, or made you feel something deep, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Black Unbreakable, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your story too, because this isn't the end. We'll be back with more stories that reveal the quiet struggles, bold strength, and hidden triumphs of Black lives, the ones too powerful to stay buried and too inspiring to forget. Until next time, stay strong, stay unbreakable,